Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The program of national security in the INSS deals with Israel internally as far as its hard force, mainly the military. That's why we're always all here with fatigues. And also the Israeli society with aspects relating to connection with the sources of power of the military. The source of power of the military, of course, is the Israeli society, the legitimacy and the security, the resources, the finances, and of course, human resources. We are a military of the people, and this is exactly what it means. The fundamental or the core fact for this panel is that on October 7th, or maybe even October 8th, Israel embarked in a known way, and look at the cabinet decisions, the war cabinet, they decided on 5 goals. Later on, they added a sixth. The significance of these goals, and we're not going to get into analyzing them, but is that Israel is embarking on a long war in an unprecedented way in history. When you take the events from October 7th until today, and multiply this with the intensity of the fight and its length, we never had such a fight, including the War of Independence. The personal experience that fighters, commanders, warriors that jumped into the fight on October 7th, regular and reserves, and are fighting, some of them until today, this is unprecedented. There were maybe peaks in our history in the big wars, but not for a prolonged period of time like now. The command challenge is unprecedented, and all this engulfs the Israeli society that approaches or arrives at this incident with the shock of the massacre of October 7th. And we need now to bring out of it these resources, as I said, physical, of trust, in an unprecedented way. This thing, when of course the war is not over yet, it's still ahead, we don't know where it will lead to. It is being managed in many arenas. Another fundamental fact, the IDF has not been built in Israel's national security doctrine, that of course does not exist and it's not written, but it's very clear in the decisions that are made on a daily basis, was built in an opposite way of thinking. And I'm not going to analyze this in depth. From the days of Ben Gurion until today is, and this is not a vague concept, this is the way we build the force. This is how we teach and train the soldiers. This is how we maintain the relationship between the IDF and the society, is that wars are short, they're decisive, and quickly return back to routine or routine security, because the goal is to reach the period of quiet before the next war. Ben Gurion said this in the 50s, and this holds until today. So this war, where the very first decisions we decided it's going to be long, the IDF and the society come with a perception that is different, and this is unprecedented. I want to start the decision here from the field, and no one can describe the field better than Hanoch. Hanoch jumped into the fight on October 7th. He was on leave from the military, about to be to retire, and he was in fights, some of the more difficult, challenging battles during this war until the middle of last year. And I want to ask you, and you are battle hardened, you have a medal from Second Lebanon War from 2006. Can you tell me how much is the experience, yourself and the soldiers you commanded, how is this different? What challenge does this create? There's another factor that is significant, and it's the first war in the era of social networks. We saw this on October 7th, and we see this later on. Social networks brought in a great dimension that we were not aware of, except the matter of the prolonged fight and the way we came into the fight. It was a different, more intense way. are quickly updated, and we can see everyone involved through the social network. In principle, the beginning of the war was an experience that was very powerful. People were it was very clear that because of what happened, the sense of duty, and for me personally, joining maneuvering forces and also leading forces into battle, an inherent part in the beginning is to return the sense of security and their own sense of security, because we began from uncertainty. Beyond this, we tried to bring value into the fort. We began this from the beginning, and also when I commanded forces in the beginning, it was to go to the classic military structure as we understood Hamas, as we knew Hamas, and we struck them in a very structured manner to dismantle Hamas battalions, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of destruction, but less effective than we thought. An Israeli IDF division attacks a battalion of the enemy, and ultimately a lot of frustration, a lot of destruction, but not a lot of achievements. At this phase, I think there was full recruitment and dedication to duty by the soldiers, including with our forced employment, fires employment, understanding where we're going and how this campaign is developing. There was difficulty to translate it, but we again, it was very clear. We had a division facing a battalion to dismantle the enemy. Something said off mic. I think after the ceasefire, there's a change happening now, or an attempt by the IDF to change something and to bring something else. We could see this but with the 98th Division maneuver in Khan Yunis, something that is a bit transformative. But from that point, there's a professional frustration that we can see. Some of the order of battle was transferred or relocated to the north, and we started to clear areas. We broadened the Netzarim corridor in northern Gaza, our presence in the south in the Philadelphia route, and this created missions that are very complex to the soldiers. Add to this the load, personal load on the soldiers, and then you could see the percentages of soldiers showing up for reserve duty. They were reducing. We don't hear a lot now about this. And also in things that we're relating now with the reservists, you don't hear a lot of problems of people not believing in the fight, or that, there are no value problems. It's more a personal issue. I have problems at home. I don't see where this is going. We can see this not only with reserves, but also with the regular force. There are problems with discipline within soldiers, and you can understand the ramifications or the reasons and the ramifications of this. There's sometimes a problem of command structure, and this is what happens when an army fights for so long. People sometimes don't understand the overall goal. And moving, as you're still wearing uniform, you published a piece or a letter where you address senior leadership, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the fact that, and you did this when? May 24, the fact that the responsibility of the command did not take accountability for October 7th, this filtered down and hurt the command structure. Can you maybe say a word about what this was about and describe the situation today as you see it? I think the fact that commanders did not realize their accountability in day one, commanders that failed directly, and we can point who they are. Most of the commanders in the IDF for a year and a half still are leading people that failed, literally failed. Besides saying that they're responsible, they didn't fulfill the responsibility. This creates a problem of trust from the lower ranks to the high ranks, because a company commander said, this is the way it is. The commanders are not leaving, so there's a crack in the belief. Another thing is the direct attacks by political echelon to commanders. This is very problematic. It's a bit different in the ISA, but within the IDF, this thing, together with social media, burns the issue that is trust. And the reality that this leads to inside the IDF is a culture of more of the same. People are in their shell, not thinking critically, not doubting, not criticizing. You can see this also in Syrian leadership, and today, according to rumors, also with the next phase in Gaza. And this reflects on the ability of the IDF to analyze itself, to carry out action after action review. This is professional and moral, afraid to go out and lead from the front in criticism. And this is a military that doesn't correct itself, it does not improve. And we can see this and also with the moral question of some imagery that comes out, the way we operate our forces in Gaza. This is morally. And professionally, we see more of the same, not correcting errors. Some things we don't know, I'm sure we'll see it later on. Thank you, Guy. First, I want to remind Guy Hazot, formerly commander of the Kfir Brigade, but for these purposes here in the war, you lead the operational learning effort in the IDF, and you are exposed to all the reviews or the after-action reviews. And I'm asking you to take Hanoch's words and take it one step further or up. On the one hand, your book was written mostly before October 7th, even though in the current publication or the current edition, you have parts about the war, and I recommend to all of you to read the entire book, but mainly the prologue and epilogue that deal with the incidents of the beginning of the war. On the one hand, we're not going to get into it, the ground forces of the IDF with its lack of abilities after being neglected for many years. If you can give us the view on issues of stamina for a prolonged period of time, for command authority, for discipline from your perspective as you saw it. So I'll begin by saying that ultimately, no doubt that October 7th is the biggest failure in the history of Zionism, I think, not only the State of Israel, because also before the establishment of the State of Israel, we did not have such an incident. And for the credit of the IDF and the Israeli society, I lived in England for a year and 3 years in Singapore. I don't know many societies or many militaries that would have bounced back so fast from such a failure to stand up because of people like Hanoch that simply ran into the fire even if they didn't have an official capacity and saved people in villages. More than that, besides the book, and I did a research that took me the entire time of COVID. I talk about why the IDF neglected the ground forces. This IDF rose and was fighting in one of the most complex arenas, prepared above and underground. And the IDF operated relatively in success compared to its readiness. But several things happened. We fought contrary to the doctrine of war that Ben-Gurion created after the War of Independence, without the dimension of time. When you fight without a dimension of time, and you define missions without outcomes or without clear goals, so you conquer Jabalia for the first time, for the second time, and only the third time. You do it with operational accomplishments, and you define it with time. And then ultimately the result is not achieving the goals of the war. Besides the fact that we're doing a big mistake on the political level because we're not deciding what's going to happen with humanitarian assistance. This was one of the worst decisions, and as was said before, the worst decision is not to decide. And then we have a very low tempo of operations. And this is because we reduced the size of this army. We can't fight simultaneously. The war turns into a war of attrition in a way. And the fact, and this should be said, I'm sorry to say this, unlike the Yom Kippur War, the price was more important than the mission. In the Yom Kippur War, we fought in order to win at all costs. Even though the price was very bad, it was still more important than the mission. Hamas had a dimension that he was very clear with, the underground, subterranean warfare. We brought in or introduced only special forces with a very special and calculated and secure way. So there was an entire dimension where we didn't fight. It's like in 2002 deciding that we're not going into the refugee camps because we're expecting many casualties. And this had a very heavy price. But I think the main problem of the IDF throughout this war is that the war developed into a long war of attrition without achieving the goals of the war. And we see a collapse of the IDF spirit. And people immediately go to the purity of arms or values. I think in the macro, even though the Hamas committed atrocities, the potential could have been worse. We did not deal with what other militaries did when they were hit with even less harsh attacks. But there are many issues that we should deal with. And it's not only purity of arms, there are other values in the IDF spirit or code of ethics that are being collapsed because the IDF is not commanded now. Because many of the decision makers have butter on their head, and when you have butter on your head, you can't define red lines and you can't expect much. And this hurts professionalism. This means there's a problem with discipline. Adhering or sticking to fulfilling the mission is a problem. And besides sense of duty and friendship, a lot of the other values need significant dealing with. I'm sorry we don't have a lot of time. Most of the people listening to us here are saying, wait a second. Also, the way the war is managed is because of the political echelon, isn't it? You weren't in the general staff, but you were senior enough to understand, including other countries. People say, what do you want from the army? The military only fulfills the goals defined by the political echelon. I assume that people that are responsible for the military see these things. Where should the military be facing the political echelon? And we'll say it as it is. Some political in the political echelon want the war to be prolonged. There's a disconnect in a way or lack of trust between the senior leadership and the political echelon. We had this when we entered the war. Let's face it. The political echelon has a problem where senior leaders, in a way, don't trust them. The military had or was acting according to a different standard relating to the judicial reform. Remember the declarations made by reservists that said they won't come, and the political echelon had criticism. Let's not get into politics here now, but there was a rift between these echelons. In the time of the disengagement in 2005, I was a battalion commander back then. The IDF was very aggressive. Even when someone at night wore an orange shirt, this means a political expression. And this led to a very difficult rift or challenging rift. And of course, there's the failure of October 7th. That's the most significant failure militarily in the history of Israel. Still, at a certain point, the IDF should have defined red lines. We don't cross this red line. For instance, the recent example is the best. It can't be that the head of IDI, intelligence, said something in a closed meeting. This is leaked by the Minister of Defense, and then Minister of Defense criticizes the J2 or the head of the intelligence publicly. You can't cross this red line. I'm not sure that the relationship between the political echelon and is only because of this, but let's move to Idit now and ask you first on a factual level. We, the INSS, and you deal with this here as someone who defines the content mostly. We are surveying the public from the beginning of the war in fundamental questions, and we're soon going to publish in the next few weeks a paper that will sum this up. These surveys questions like public support of the IDF, the way we review the hostages, the way the public trusts the government, etc. If you can define the development of the relationship between the Israeli society and its military throughout the time since October 7th.
Yeah, just a little question, huh? So we've been saying that throughout months of the war. When we talk about trust, public trust in IDF, we have to distinguish between two kinds of trust. Where we see one is a light dynamics, and in the other one is a more significant dynamics. So the public, despite October 7th, and even maybe because or due to October 7th, they love the IDF and embrace the IDF, and everybody has been baking cakes. And if you couldn't go do reserve, then the people would give them lifts. But so it hardly budged. So when it comes to these trust scales, when we see the ceasefire by the book, when there's less intense fighting, we see less trust. But when we see intense fighting, then we see more trust. And despite of all of these bad mouthing and tensions between the military and political echelon, and despite everything that was said here before, the public sees, and you don't have to be underground in Gaza to understand what's going on in the arena. And despite that, it doesn't mean anything regarding the great crisis of trust, maybe the biggest one that happened between the IDF and the Israeli public, when it comes to whether the Israeli public trusts the IDF, that this October 7th will not happen again. And this might be affected by all the things that were said here before, whether the public trusts the IDF to be able to already release all the inquiries. And the people are very tense about it and are waiting. And we don't know if the people will believe that these are genuine inquiries. If the IDF says there are no tunnels, will the public believe the IDF that there are no underground tunnels in the north? Not because they saw it, but rather because the IDF said so. And we've seen that the public since the beginning of the war, during the war, and even today, they said, I also heard that they said that Hamas has been deterred, right? And all of these societal value processes that have been happening in the IDF in some way, maybe surprising, are not assisting enhancing the trust. Some people, I mean, the public sentiment sometimes corresponds with the IDF, and sometimes they're confused between what the public demands and what in fact increases the trust. Like you say, they sometimes confuse between trust and popularity. Yes. And here we go back to the story of I maybe don't really. I disagree a bit with Guy about the fact that the political echelon lost trust with the military because of the way they dealt with the disengagement. And we saw when the chief of staff started his role, we've seen the distrust before he even started. And it has to do with the judiciary reform. What do they claim against the judiciary system? That they're not diverse. And we hear the same claims when it comes to the high-ranking soldiers. We don't have enough horses. They all talk about spirit of IDF only when it comes to purity of the arms, etc. And in some way, the army thought that maybe subconsciously that some corresponds with the sentiment, so they don't deal with disobedience that reflects a public sentiment that is quite common, like the international law, it's nice to have, but please, during the war, let's put it away for a while. This might enhance the trust, but it didn't happen. In fact, in the field, it didn't happen. When the public sees that the IDF is not focused and is not enforcing obedience and discipline, whether it's because the middle ranking or low ranking soldiers don't have trust for the high ranks because they didn't in fact been responsible. Who am I to now enforce discipline or take one of the commanders out of their jobs when I'm still sitting in my chair, in my position, after so many months? What the public sees is that there's no discipline in the IDF, and no matter what I think about the IDF or the politics, it doesn't enhance trust. It makes trust collapse.
I want to start with you, the second round and the final round, because again, we're pressed with time. First, we have to remind us the IDF had operational achievements, significant ones. We were focused in Gaza. Most of the force that was deployed, the ground forces, were in Gaza. There was an operation in Lebanon, but it was a second derivative of an operational move, unprecedented probably, of dismantling maybe the most dangerous threat on our borders in a different way of action. But if the war comes back to high intensity, I want to ask you this question. There's a question, of course, if the reserves will show up or not. Should this be measured with how many people show up? Are there other parameters, and what would you recommend to the military senior leadership? Because political echelon, we're not giving the recommendations because we don't want to deal with something impractical. how to deal and what to broadcast, not only to preserve the trust of the society, but the functionality of the military.
First of all, I've learned not to predict whether people will show up or not, because in the Israeli society it's a bit difficult. At some point, people just show up no matter what. But beyond the question of being of the way being just, people are really concerned about the decision making. We've seen that throughout all the questions that we've asked, that the people think that the most significant decisions that were taken, I mean, the IDF applies the decisions of the politics, and these decisions are completely corrupted by politics. And I think that if there's a doubt, any doubt, that now we are calling our people reservists for the 400-day or what of reserves. It's not only about reserves. We talk to families of soldiers who are enlisted, and if there's any doubt that we're now calling them back to endanger their lives, to risk their lives, and the people think that it has been quite a significant risk taken here when it comes to personnel, to manpower, and if we only do it to make someone feel, well, it's just more, but it's just more of the same, and it will not bring us to the absolute victory that we wish for. Maybe people will not show up, as was said here, and maybe also, even if they show up, the influences can't be that even if they show up now, we have many years in the future to manage Israel. And if they will say we kept showing up and showing up, but it was a futile war and we risked our lives for bad causes, maybe at the time in the future, I hope it will not happen, but when another war arises, excuse me for stopping you, but maybe it has to do with something we never mentioned, which is the hostages. And in our surveys, we've seen that there's a change in the stance of most of the public today sees bringing back the hostages as the highest goal of the war. And such a move could be perceived in the way it happens as opposed. Yes, this is exactly what it is. Of the fact that you're saying that there has been a change, the fact that the public didn't mention bringing back the hostages as the highest goal was because the public was believing what it was told by both by the military and political echelon, that the two goals of the highest goal are interrelated. We don't have to choose between this and that. And the chief of staff said very clearly that the military pressure will help bringing back the hostages, and they kept saying that on, and the public believed. But the reality speaks louder than numbers of surveys, and the public saw that they're not coming back. They're not being brought back. What Eisenkot said, if anyone thinks that it's going to happen like the Entebbe operation, people didn't have to hear it after a while. We just saw it happen. But the political pressure, in fact, killed the hostages. Excuse me for speaking so harshly. Instead of bringing them back. So when people internalize this after such a long war, and I will only say that you started by saying we were prepared for a prolonged war. No, I didn't say they prolonged. They prepared us. No, you said that when they set 5 goals, it was clear that it's going to be a long war. But when we asked about the public, they said less than 10% thought it's going to be more than a year. So it was prolonged, the war. The way the people are saying, the way Hamas will not be deterred in the way that we were told about this absolute victory. The realization and the bringing back of the hostages that are brought back, we can't escape from imagining different things than the reality is now showing us. And now I think that there is full support for going to the second phase.
Guy, if you look today at senior leadership, yesterday it started with a big conference in the IDF where the senior leadership were presented with some of the reviews from today. They will start to be published. It will be a very intense week relating to these reviews. In this point in time, before continuation of the military, how should senior leadership act? I think according to what I said before. First, we have to draw a very clear line to the political echelon and stop these wild attacks on the IDF. It's destructive. We cannot accept this anymore. There's a rift and lack of trust with Israeli society. We need to fix this. We need to finish not only the reviews of the 7th of October, but of the war itself, and present it in transparency to the public with bottom lines, including firing those directly responsible for October 7th and other problems during the war. And the third is aggressive treatment and bringing back the train on tracks with the values and conduct of the IDF, because this is unacceptable. The IDF needs a national program because it has a serious lack of people, first in regular service, but also with the recruitment of the ultra-Orthodox. As the Chief of General Staff said at Badechad, the officer training school, we can't leave this for the next generations because we won't solve the problems that we have with human resources. With the professional military, we have to reconstruct the military and lead to readiness for the future challenges. If it's in Gaza or other arenas, and we didn't even talk about Judea and Samaria yet. Hanoch, I want to ask you in conclusion. You are the chairman of the fighters of the Iron Swords War. Those of you who remember the years after the Yom Kippur War, after 74, from the reservists, the fighters that came back to war, this is where the social change in Israel began that technically led to the toppling of the Golda Meir government, but also more fundamentally led to a political change and the change of the Israeli society. I am now defining you as the representative of the fighters of Iron Swords War. What change do you think should emerge from this so powerful thing that we're feeling since October 7th? I think that unlike the Yom Kippur War, we are now in a situation where a significant part of the reservists is less as far as percentage from Yom Kippur, and we should be honest and say that the nature of the people that are remaining is different. This means their interests, what leads them has changed. So I don't believe that the change or the revolution will come from within the IDF. It will come from various organizations. It could be families of the hostages, some specific reservists with their own interests. And I think something else will emerge that will demand change, will demand a new contract between the country and its citizens, between the people who serve reserve or regular service with their commanders. I think it will take time. We're still in the period of shock. We didn't even move to the next phase, which is the phase of mourning. Certainly in the reservists, we're dealing with personal sustainment, and the social rifts are such, like the rabbi said in the beginning, people are or in this camp or in that camp, and there's not enough middle ground. Only later on we'll be able to understand where we are and where we're going, but it will take time. Not in the next 2 years, unfortunately. As we said, we were able to only scratch the surface, maybe the top layer of the huge efforts that the end of it is not still yet in sight. We in the program of national security in the INSS, we deal with this also with the operators inside the various systems. We're very much in touch with them. And this struggle ultimately is not only of the IDF, but of the Israeli society as a whole. It relates to all of us. And the IDF, as I said in the beginning, comes from the society and goes back to the society. The face of the IDF will be the face of the society. So the struggle is the face and the success of the IDF. Thank you all.